Tokyo, June 5, 1942. Inside the polished wooden halls of the Naval General Staff Building, the air felt unnaturally heavy. Officers walked quickly but spoke softly, their boots echoing across marble floors like distant gunfire. Japan had never known defeat at sea. For 6 months, their navy had swept across the Pacific like a storm. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Every report brought triumph, every dispatch carried victory. And for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the heart of that triumph was its carriers: Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, the floating castles of the rising sun. But on that morning, in the High Command's map room, something felt wrong. Admiral Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, stood at the center table surrounded by maps covered in red and blue markers. A courier arrived, breathless, carrying a coded message from the Midway task force. Officers gathered as the message was opened, expecting news of a glorious victory, another crushing blow, another step toward forcing the Americans to their knees. Instead, the first line froze the room. Akagi badly damaged, Soryu burning, Kaga hit. Silence. Total, absolute silence. No one spoke. No one breathed. For a moment, the officers believed it must be a mistake, some error in transmission. Carriers didn't simply fall. They were the pride of Japan. They were the weapons with which they had shattered the Americans at Pearl Harbor. Nagano cleared his throat, forcing the room back to order. He demanded clarification. Minutes later, the second message arrived, short, clipped, and devastating. Kaga lost. Soryu sinking. Akagi uncontrollable. An officer covering his mouth whispered, "This cannot be." Another stepped backward as if struck. Then came the message that shattered whatever hope remained. Hiryu heavily damaged. Enemy dive bombers unstoppable. Every man in the room understood instantly. This wasn't a defeat. This was a catastrophe. A disaster so immense that it ripped the foundation from under Japan's war plan. The 4 carriers they lost at Midway were not just ships. They were the irreplaceable core of Japan's elite. The veteran pilots, the deck crews, the commanders who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, gone in a single day. Nagano's hands trembled as he lowered the telegram. Admiral Toyota whispered, "The Americans, how did they know?" And in the back of the room, another officer murmured the question no one wanted to voice aloud. Is the war turning? When the final report arrived, Akagi scuttled, Hiryu lost. Officers felt the world beneath them shift. The pride of the Imperial Navy, gone. The momentum of the empire, broken. And for the first time since the war began, the Japanese High Command felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Because they understood what no one else in Japan knew yet. At Midway, the Empire had not simply lost carriers. They had lost the war they thought they could win. The sun had barely risen over Tokyo when the shock began to ripple through the military hierarchy. Messages arrived at the Naval Ministry in fragments, broken signals, emergency transmissions, incomplete distress calls from the Midway Task Force. Each message was worse than the last. What started as confusion quickly transformed into dread. Officers rushed through hallways carrying decoded dispatches, their faces pale as rice paper, their voices reduced to stiff whispers. The Battle of Midway had been expected to be Japan's second Pearl Harbor, a strike that would crush American naval resistance for years. Instead, it was becoming something unthinkable, a total reversal of fortune. Admiral Osami Nagano sat rigidly at the head of a long, polished table, his jaw clenched as he stared at a growing pile of telegrams. The High Command had held firm belief that Japan's carrier strike force, the legendary Kido Butai, was invincible. These were the same ships that devastated Pearl Harbor, the same crews who had conquered half of Asia. And now, in a matter of hours, they were vanishing from the map like ink washed from paper. The room smelled of tobacco smoke and tension. The air felt suffocating. A young officer rushed in with another decoded telegram. His hands were shaking so badly that the paper rattled as he passed it to Nagano. The message was short, blunt, horrifying. Akagi abandoned, scuttling underway. There was no ceremony, no dramatics, just cold truth. Gasps echoed across the room. A senior general lowered his head as if the ceiling had collapsed. Another officer whispered, "The flagship, gone," as though saying it out loud might reverse the reality. Then came the next telegram. Kaga sunk. Moments later, Soryu, aflame and unmanageable, followed by the final blow. Hiryu, critically damaged, crew abandoning. The backbone of Japan's naval power, 4 of its 6 first-line carriers, was gone in a single day. On the far side of the room, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, stood silently. He had not spoken a word. His face was carved from stone, but the tension around his eyes betrayed the pain inside. Yamamoto had warned Japan's leadership that the empire could not sustain a long war with the United States. He had told them Japan had only 6 months to win, 6 months before American industry awakened like a giant. Now that giant had awakened, and Midway was the first strike of its awakening fist. A messenger approached Yamamoto timidly. "Admiral, we lost contact with Hiryu. It is presumed lost." Yamamoto didn't look up. He simply exhaled, slow and heavy. "Everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong," whispered Vice Admiral Ugaki beside him. Nagano slammed his fist on the table, not in anger, but in despair. How did this happen? How could the Americans know our plans? How could they strike first? How? No one answered, because the truth was too terrifying. The Americans had broken their codes. The Japanese High Command had no idea they were reading their messages like an open book. To the admirals in Tokyo, it felt like the Americans had struck with supernatural precision, as if they knew the exact moment the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. One officer finally spoke, his voice thin and trembling. "If this is true, if all 4 carriers are gone, then our offensive capability is crippled." Nagano stared at him. "Crippled? No, it is worse than that." He turned toward the room, and for the first time in Japanese wartime leadership, the mask of confidence cracked. "This may have cost us the war." The room fell into suffocating silence, because deep inside, every man there knew the truth. Midway wasn't simply a battle lost. It was the moment the Empire's destiny shifted from unstoppable expansion to inevitable collapse.
Far from Tokyo, on board the flagship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the news that would break the backbone of the Imperial Navy and shatter him personally. Yamamoto was not just another commander. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the mastermind behind Japan's early victories, the man whose strategic genius had shaken the United States to its core. But he was also the one Japanese leader who understood the dangerous path Japan had chosen. He had studied in America, understood its industrial power, knew its people, and feared the long war Japan would be forced to fight if they failed to break U.S. naval strength early. Now, as the radio man on Yamato approached him with trembling hands, Yamamoto already sensed the weight of the message. The ocean outside was calm, the waves gently hitting the hull of the largest battleship ever built, a false, cruel calm that stood in complete contrast to the chaos unfolding across the Pacific. The first line of the decoded report hit him like a physical blow. Akagi, lost. Then the next, Kaga, sunk, followed quickly by Soryu, destroyed. Yamamoto closed his eyes. The officers around him froze in place, the room shrinking into a suffocating silence. The Pearl Harbor Strike Force, the pride of Japan, the carriers he had personally selected for the opening blow against America, were gone. But the final line was the one that shattered him. Hiryu ceased all operations. Crew abandoned. Hiryu had been the last Japanese carrier still fighting, desperately launching counterattacks after the others were crippled. With its loss, Japan no longer had a single operational carrier at Midway. Yamamoto stood perfectly still. His officers didn't dare speak. They watched as the admiral lowered the report slowly, his jaw tightening, eyes filled with a rare and painful sorrow. He knew the truth instantly. The war Japan thought it had won was now unwinnable. He turned to the windows of the command room, staring into the empty Pacific. The sea looked endless, cold, and indifferent, a silent witness to the empire collapsing beneath the waves. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "The Americans were waiting for us." His staff exchanged panicked glances. Yamamoto continued, each word sounding like a funeral bell. "We walked into a trap." And then, as if confessing to himself, he added, "I feared this moment, and now it has come." The officers around him felt their hearts sink. The man they believed to be invincible, the brilliant mind that had delivered victory after victory, now looked defeated, not by the enemy, but by his own prophecy. Because Yamamoto had warned Japan's leaders, "If I must fight, I will run wild for 6 months. After that, I guarantee nothing." Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, his prediction had come true. Midway was the turning point he had feared. Midway was the moment America struck back. Midway was the moment Japan's fate shifted forever. He took a breath and gave the order no Japanese commander ever wanted to speak. "All forces withdraw." The war would continue, but Yamamoto knew Japan would never again command the Pacific as it once had. Because at Midway, they didn't just lose ships, they lost time, pilots, momentum, and the future.
In Tokyo, as the scale of the disaster became undeniable, the Naval General Staff called an emergency meeting, a gathering so critical, so historically heavy, that even the walls of the command chamber seemed to hold their breath. The long polished conference table was surrounded by Japan's most powerful military minds. Admiral Nagano, Toyoda, Shimada, Kaga, and the senior strategists who had guided Japan's rapid expansion across Asia and the Pacific. But now, the room felt different. The air carried not the confidence of victory, but the unbearable weight of catastrophe. Once sharp voices were replaced with muttering disbelief. Maps that once represented Japan's sweeping dominance now lay beneath telegrams drenched in failure. An officer dimmed the overhead lights, as if lowering the brightness would soften the tragedy displayed across the table. The war had shifted in a single day, and every man there knew it. Admiral Nagano, who had always spoken with the tone of absolute authority, now struggled to maintain composure. He placed both hands on the table and took a long, weary breath. "We must understand the situation," he said, though his voice trembled. "We must face the truth." A staff officer stepped forward and began reading the casualty list, not of men, but of ships. 4 first-line carriers, hundreds of aircraft, the irreplaceable elite pilots who had spearheaded the victories at Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, and the Coral Sea, the deck crews who had perfected the art of carrier warfare. Each loss was more than a ship. It was the death of experience, decades of training, and the last remnants of Japan's offensive capabilities. As the report continued, the room began to break. One officer's jaw tightened until it trembled. Another stared blankly at the table, eyes unfocused, as though his mind refused to believe what he was hearing. Vice Admiral Shimada clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. The board of lights representing Japan's carrier fleet,
once glowing brightly, now showed a horrifying gap of darkness. Only Shokaku and Zuikaku remained, both damaged, both depleted, both incapable of mounting another large-scale offensive. Admiral Toyota finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Without carriers, how do we strike? The silence afterward was suffocating. Then the door slid open and Admiral Yamamoto entered, summoned urgently by radio from Yamato. The entire room stood. They weren't saluting. They were reacting to the presence of a man whose strategic brilliance had led Japan to triumph after triumph. But today, even Yamamoto's expression could not hide the truth. He looked exhausted, older, as if the disaster had carved deep lines into his soul. Taking his seat, he spread the Midway damage reports before him and spoke slowly, his voice heavy with a clarity that cut through the panic. We did not lose a battle. We lost our ability to fight the war we planned. No one dared interrupt. Yamamoto continued. Our carriers are gone. Our air crews are gone. Our momentum is broken. And the Americans... He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. The Americans will now come for us. The room recoiled. Officers exchanged fearful glances. They knew exactly what he meant. The United States, with its endless factories, its resurging navy, and its perfect intelligence, could now go on the offensive, and Japan had no way to stop it. Admiral Shimada reluctantly asked the question that everyone feared. What do we tell the Emperor? The silence was thicker than the humid Tokyo air. Yamamoto answered quietly. We tell him the truth, that our carriers have been destroyed, and with them, our hopes of victory. Another officer whispered, How will the people react? Nagano stared at the table, his voice hollow. We will not tell them. Not yet. Japan cannot endure this shock. And that was the final devastating blow. Not only had Japan lost at Midway, they were too afraid to tell their own nation. In that moment, the Japanese High Command realized something far darker than defeat. Midway was not merely a loss on the battlefield. It was the beginning of the end. The Empire's unstoppable expansion had reached its peak. From now on, every battle would be fought in retreat. Every victory would be smaller. Every loss would cut deeper. And still, none of them wanted to say the words that hung unspoken in the air. We cannot win this war anymore. But they all knew. And the silence was louder than any explosion.
In the days following the Midway disaster, Tokyo was not a city celebrating victory or even preparing for the next offensive. It became a city holding its breath, a city where whispers replaced confidence, where newspapers printed half-truths, and where high-ranking officers walked with lowered eyes. While the public was told Midway was merely a setback, the truth inside the naval headquarters was far darker. The Japanese High Command, once radiant with pride, now resembled a collapsing empire trying desperately to stand upright even as the floor crumbled beneath them. Inside a sealed conference room in the Imperial Navy Ministry, the highest-ranking admirals gathered again, this time not to plan expansion, but to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. On one side of the massive table, maps marked Japan's Pacific holdings stretching from Burma to the Aleutians, oil fields, island bases, fleet routes, all symbols of a nation that had expanded too far, too fast. But on the other side of the table lay the Midway intelligence reports, pages filled with irrecoverable losses, a ledger of destruction so absolute that the weight of it seemed to pull the entire room downward. Vice Admiral Kaga spoke first, rubbing his forehead with a trembling hand. We underestimated their carriers, he admitted quietly. We believed they were still at Pearl Harbor. repairing. Another officer responded, his voice raw. We believed wrong, completely wrong. Admiral Toyota leaned forward, tapping the intelligence summary. We strike, yet they know. We move, yet they intercept. We attack, yet they ambush. How? His voice cracked with frustration. How could the Americans predict our moves so perfectly? The truth, that the Americans had broken the Japanese naval code, was still unknown to most in the room, but the signs were there. Every officer could feel it. The Americans were too precise, too prepared, too coordinated. Yamamoto finally entered the discussion, his voice calm but heavy with unspoken pain. The enemy did not guess, he said. They knew. The room froze. The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. Everyone turned toward him. No one dared interrupt. For the Americans to strike so accurately, at such a moment, with such timing, this was not coincidence. We have been exposed. Predictable. They saw our weakness before we even knew it existed. A chilling silence followed. The implications were terrifying. If the Americans could read their plans, if the Americans could anticipate their moves, then every operation Japan planned was already compromised. Admiral Nagano broke the silence with a confession none of them wanted to acknowledge. Our Navy cannot replace these losses. Not the ships, not the planes, certainly not the pilots. Around the room, the truth sank deeper. Japan's training programs took years to shape elite aviators. The United States could train hundreds in months. Japan had limited factories. America had hundreds. Japan had scarce fuel reserves. America had endless supplies. For the first time since the war began, the Imperial Navy faced the stark truth. Japan had woken a giant, and the giant was fully awake now. A junior strategist, voice unsteady, tried to suggest, "We still have our battleships," but Yamamoto cut him off with a quiet shake of his head. Battleships are meaningless in this war. The carriers were the heart. He paused, and the heart has stopped beating. The officers exchanged despairing looks. A sense of doom filled the chamber. Not panic, but a slow, crushing understanding that the Empire's greatest weapon had been shattered. Midway had not merely reduced Japan's power, it had reversed the momentum of the entire Pacific War. From that moment, the Japanese High Command understood something they had never dared believe. The United States could not be stopped, not by surprise attacks, not by superior training, not by bold strategies, not by courage alone. Japan had lost its offensive capability, and the war, once expanding outward in glorious waves, would now collapse inward, island by island, ship by ship, man by man. In that room, beneath dim lantern light and maps stained with sweat, every admiral felt it deep in their bones. Midway was the moment Japan's future changed from victory to survival.
For days after the Battle of Midway, Japan's wartime government walked a dangerous tightrope, balancing national pride against an unfolding catastrophe. While the public received softened statements about damage inflicted on both sides, the truth was escorted quietly behind the closed doors of the Imperial Palace. Emperor Hirohito, who rarely received unfiltered military reports, was about to be confronted with the first whisper that something had gone terribly wrong. His palace, usually a place of calm ritual and political distance, suddenly became the final stop for news too devastating to acknowledge openly. On a humid June evening, the emperor sat in his private study, surrounded by scrolls, reports, and the steady tick of an ornate clock. The room was serene, tatami floors, lacquered cabinets, soft lantern light. But the serenity cracked the moment the sliding doors opened and two senior naval advisors entered, their faces pale like men walking into a funeral. General Sugiyama bowed deeply, lingering longer than protocol required. Admiral Shimada followed, his uniform damp with sweat despite the cool palace air. Between them, they carried a small stack of sealed documents, the first summaries of the Midway disaster scheduled for the Emperor's eyes.
Hirohito noticed immediately. The room shifted. "What is the matter?" he asked quietly, adjusting his glasses. Shimada hesitated. Then, with the stiffness of a man revealing a national wound, he spoke. "Your Majesty, our navy has suffered severe losses." There was a long pause. Hirohito did not respond at first. He simply stared at Shimada, unsure whether he had heard correctly. Losses? Severe? That word had barely existed in Japan's vocabulary since 1937. For years, the empire had marched flawlessly from victory to victory. The emperor leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "How severe?" Shimada swallowed. His voice trembled. 4 first-line aircraft carriers have been lost." The emperor blinked. Once. Twice. As if his mind refused to accept the meaning. 4, he whispered. The carriers were the jewels of the Imperial Navy, the crown of its power, the symbols of Japan's technological might. Lost in one battle? It was unthinkable. Beside him, General Sugiyama explained carefully, choosing each word with surgical precision. The Americans struck with overwhelming accuracy. Their timing was perfect. They attacked at the exact moment our decks were covered with armed aircraft. We believe they anticipated our moves. The meaning settled over the emperor like a suffocating fog. The Americans had somehow predicted Japan's strategy and annihilated the Kido Butai, the same elite strike force that had shattered Pearl Harbor. Hirohito lowered his gaze. He appeared calm, but the tension in his jaw revealed the storm behind his eyes. "And the officers?" he asked. Shimada bowed his head. "Nearly all lost, Your Majesty." Silence filled the study like a crushing weight. The emperor closed the report. His fingers trembled slightly, the first visible sign of emotion he had shown in years. The loss of ships was bad enough, but the loss of elite aviators, trained over a decade, impossible to replace, was the true death sentence. Once gone, Japan had no path to rebuild such skill, not with its limited fuel, limited factories, limited manpower. "Why was this not foreseen?" the emperor finally asked. General Sugiyama responded with a voice barely above a whisper. "We believed the Americans were weaker than they were." The emperor looked up sharply. It was the closest thing to anger his advisors had ever seen from him. "You believed incorrectly." Another silence. He rose slowly, walking to the window overlooking the palace gardens, the moon reflecting off the pond, the branches swaying gently in the summer wind. A peaceful scene, utterly detached from the catastrophe that now threatened the nation. Then Hirohito spoke, his voice soft but heavy with realization. "This battle changes the war, does it not?" Shimada bowed again. "Yes, Your Majesty. It changes everything." And in that quiet, devastating moment, Emperor Hirohito understood, perhaps more clearly than any man in Japan, that the empire's unstoppable march had ended. The wave that had carried Japan across the Pacific had peaked, and now it would begin to fall back, slowly at first, then relentlessly, crushing everything in its path. The emperor did not shout, he did not panic, he simply closed his eyes and inhaled, whispering the words no one else dared speak. "Then the war will only grow darker from here." And he was right. Midway was not just a military defeat. It was the moment the empire confronted reality.
Across the Japanese home front, life continued as if nothing had changed. Shops opened, trains ran on schedule, newspapers carried carefully crafted headlines of minor victories. But inside the dim rooms of the Japanese press bureau, the truth of Midway was being buried under layers of ink, silence, and fear. The government understood that the loss of 4 carriers, combined with thousands of elite airmen, would not just shock the nation, it would shatter its spirit. Japan's people believed in an unbroken chain of victories. They trusted the Navy as an invincible shield protecting the Empire's vast new territories. To reveal the truth behind Midway would mean acknowledging that the shield was cracked and that the Empire's greatest weapon had been destroyed. The press bureau headquarters became the center of this desperate cover-up. Editors from major newspapers were summoned in secrecy. They bowed stiffly as stern officers spread sanitized reports across the table, carefully edited summaries describing Midway as a hard-fought battle with heavy damage inflicted on the enemy. Not a single line mentioned Japan's true losses. No Akagi, no Kaga, no Soryu, no Hiryu. Instead, the focus was shifted to fictional American ships sunk and vague strategic adjustments. The journalists knew they were being handed half-truths at best, but in wartime Japan, questioning the military was dangerous. The Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police, watched everything. A raised eyebrow could mean interrogation. A printed doubt could mean arrest. Meanwhile, across Japan's cities, radios broadcast patriotic music and speeches praising the bravery of our sailors at Midway. Children recited songs about Japanese victory. Neighbors discussed the coming triumphs in the Pacific. But behind closed doors in military neighborhoods near Tokyo and Yokosuka, families of sailors whispered anxiously. Too many letters from the Navy had stopped arriving. Too many officers had failed to return home. Rumors swirled through the narrow streets like smoke. Inside the Navy Ministry, High Command meticulously crafted a narrative to protect national morale. Only a handful of individuals, even within the military, knew the full truth. Lower-ranking officers were told the carriers were damaged but repairable. Pilots were informed that their comrades were reassigned, not lost. Even within Japan's wartime cabinet, some ministers received only partial reports. But those who did know, the top naval strategists, carried the weight like a stone on their chest. Admiral Nagano privately admitted to a trusted aide, "If the population learns of Midway, they will question everything." Admiral Shimada added bitterly, "We have lost the air wings we cannot replace, but we cannot lose the people's confidence as well." And so the lie continued. State artists painted heroic images of Japanese aircraft striking American ships, depictions completely fabricated. Newspapers printed carefully designed maps showing Japan pushing forward, even though the tide of war had turned irrevocably. Teachers told students that Japan had won a moral victory, while ignoring the truth buried in the ocean. But even with the censorship, cracks began to appear. Fishermen returning from long voyages reported seeing wreckage of Japanese aircraft drifting on the tide. Family members of sailors heard whispers from men stationed in naval bases. Something happened at Midway, something terrible. In Hiroshima, a worker overheard naval officers speaking quietly. "The carriers are gone." The rumor spread like wildfire, but died quickly. Fear kept people silent. Inside the Imperial Palace district, secret intelligence officers struggled to intercept foreign broadcasts. American radio stations, broadcasting across the Pacific, boldly claimed victory at Midway. They reported the destruction of Japanese carriers. The Japanese government jammed the signals, but not before some listeners heard enough. For the first time since the war began, the illusion of Japan's invincibility began to flicker. The truth was too enormous to contain forever, but High Command clung to their silence. They needed time to rebuild, time to reorganize, time to prepare the nation for the battles that were coming.
But deep inside, they all knew the truth. Japan was entering a war it could no longer win, and the people still believed they were winning. The cover-up of Midway became not just a political necessity, but a symbolic moment, the moment Japan turned inward, hiding the truth from its own people, even as the Pacific slowly closed around them.
When the smoke finally settled over the Pacific and the last Midway telegram reached Tokyo, the truth became impossible to ignore. The empire that had expanded across oceans now stood on the edge of a long, grinding collapse. In the war rooms, officers whispered what no one dared speak publicly. In the palace, the emperor understood the darkness that lay ahead, and across Japan, the people continued to cheer victories that no longer existed. Midway wasn't just a battle, it was a mirror, a brutal reflection that Japan was no longer shaping the war was shaping Japan. The mighty carrier fleet that launched Pearl Harbor had been reduced to burning metal at the bottom of the sea. The elite aviators who once represented Japan's pride were gone, replaced by trainees who would never match the skill of those lost. The United States, struck down in 1941, had risen with a force unlike anything Japan imagined. Their carriers multiplied, their factories thundered, their pilots improved with every mission. And Japan, trapped between pride and survival, hid the truth even from its own people. But history cannot be hidden forever, and Midway became the moment when the world, the empire, and even the emperor himself began to understand. Japan had entered a war it could no longer win. The wave had peaked, and now it could only fall. The rest of the war would be fought not for conquest, but for time, for hope, for the illusion that victory was still possible. But deep inside every admiral, every officer, every leader who saw the Midway reports, one reality echoed louder than any explosion. Everything changed at Midway. I asked you 2 questions. Make sure you answer both in the comments below. I'm reading every single one. Question 1. Do you think Japan ever had a real chance to win the Pacific War, or was Midway the moment everything became impossible? 2. If you were a Japanese commander, would you have told the public the truth about Midway or kept it hidden to protect morale?